Welcome to Inside Communications Radio, brought to you by Media Training Worldwide. I'm Mike Bako, and today we're joined by Larry Kamer as we dive into the world of crisis communication. Larry, specifically with everything that's been going on with the Susan G. Komen Foundation, found it interesting that with everything that was swirling around, you said that the number one thing, even beyond reputation, even beyond trust, what was the number one thing that you think they lost during all of this?
I think the biggest problem that Komen had was they lost the benefit of the doubt. And the benefit of the doubt is one of those things that comes with a sterling reputation, trust, and credibility.
Which is something that they had for many, many, many years.
And I think they do have a fair amount of it still. I don't think this has destroyed the organization, but it's very much changed them in the minds of key audiences.
How does that affect them moving forward? We heard so many stories. I watched an interview with Andrea Kramer on NBC talking about how women came up to her at the gym because they knew that she was involved in the organization, and they said, no more. I'm not going to be wearing my shirts. I'm not going to be wearing the pink ribbons. I'm wearing a Susan G. Komen shirt inside out today at the gym. Those are very powerful feelings for someone to have. And even though it seems like things are now on putting things back into the positive column for them, how hard is it going to be for them to reach back out to those women who have those sentiments?
Well, I think there's a few lessons here, and I think there's a few things that Komen can do. And you start from the place where this was an incredibly strong brand with a very strong reputation that went sideways through a series of actions, some of which were its own responsibility, and some of which, quite frankly, were caused by people who had a real violent disagreement with them and kept the story alive. And that's an important lesson. When you have an unassailable brand, you actually are, I think, quite vulnerable to crisis. If you're not used to being put on the defensive for the thing that you are very strongest at, for the issues that you own. So if you're Southwest Airlines, you build the expectation of safe and pleasant travel. If you're the American Red Cross, you respond effectively to disaster and you handle the blood supply safely. And if you're Komen, you educate and fight for research and the defeat of breast cancer. If any of those things changes, and if you're put on the defensive about any of those things, that's a tough place for a lot of organizations to find themselves, and it's a tough place for you to get your footing quickly, because you're not used to being put on the defensive on those issues.
And even though they didn't quite get on their footing very fast, it was only a few days worth of story. You mentioned these organizations who are known for doing one thing, delivering one thing that they're known for. You bring up Netflix. Netflix had this horrendous PR situation moving over to their new brand, Quickster, and as you point out, this was not a few days. This was weeks and months before they decided to turn the ship around, to change course. What sort of damage can be done not only to a Netflix, but to any brand, any organization that lets it go on for that long?
Well, it's funny, there is a firestorm effect of that we saw with both of those examples, with Netflix and with Komen. Just how incredibly quickly an issue that is not addressed effectively can really catch fire. 15 years ago, the rule of thumb was if you had a crisis situation, you had to make a statement. You had to go on record about what was going on by the end of the next news cycle, which meant, by the noon news or the evening news on local television. 10 years ago, best practice was, to get something out in the first 60 minutes. But I've seen research that suggests that you literally have about 10 minutes to respond before opinion begins to gel and stories begin to take on a certain direction on Twitter and in other social media. So the one lesson is you have to be prepared to react in real time and take the surprise out of it, and that comes through gaming and scenario planning and testing and drilling.
You're listening to Inside Communications Radio. We're joined by Larry Kamer. Larry, that's an interesting point because how many organizations do that? You mentioned that everything is just changing at the speed of light, and now opinions can be cemented and made within 10 minutes of a news story breaking. How much game planning is being done before an announcement comes out, before big news comes out?
I think it's happening at various levels and probably not adequately, in general. If you're an organization that deals with disaster and crisis and conflict, the Red Cross, FEMA, government agencies that deal with fire, police, that sort of thing, testing and drilling and scenario planning that's just part of the way they do business. If you're a private company that is in a disaster-prone kind of industry, a utility company, an airline, an oil company, you tend to see a lot more of it, and frankly, a lot of this is mandated by law. But what concerns me is when you see companies with big brands that have been very successful at managing the upward trajectory, not think nearly enough about the downward trajectory, which can happen to anybody.
You mentioned earlier to me that you obviously have been involved in managing crisis and dealing with these sorts of issues for decades now, 3 decades in the business, and you teach crisis communication at USC in Southern California. What will we make of this Planned Parenthood Susan G. Komen episode as we move forward? Is this going to be something that you're going to be teaching in your classes for years to come, or do you think that this is just going to be a blip along the way, something that people will point to and say this was a crisis communication situation, but not quite the stuff of textbooks and legends? Which way do you fall on this?
Well, I think, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I have, like many people, had a lot of respect for Komen and think they do good work. They've been an important resource for breast cancer survivors and, in fact, even for people in my own family. But I think this example shows us 3 things. The first is when you have an issue that crops up that causes a divergence from what your stakeholders expect from you, your important stakeholders, that's an issue. That's an issue. That's an issues management kind of issue. When you get pushback from those stakeholders and they don't like it, that's a controversy. And when you get a situation that causes a perilous threat to your reputation or your integrity or your day-to-day business operations, that's a crisis. And I think in Komen we saw all 3.
And it's certainly going to be something that you'll probably have a great time dealing with your students. Larry, thanks for joining us today on Inside Communications.
You bet. Thank you.